Welcome back to Sage of Ground, where the untamed American West comes alive through stories of love, redemption, and the courage to change. I'm your host, and today I have an extraordinary tale that will touch your heart and remind you why love truly conquers all. Picture this: a cold-blooded gunslinger with a deadly reputation rides into a dying town seeking vengeance for his father's mysterious death 20 years ago. But what he discovers isn't just the truth about his past. It's a love so powerful it transforms his very soul, and a conspiracy so dark it threatens to destroy an entire community. This is the story of Rowan Blackstone, a man who built his life around violence and solitude, never believing he deserved happiness or a family. When he returns to Moonridge Valley, Montana in 1887, he expects to find answers about his father's supposed betrayal. Instead, he finds Sage Ember, a compassionate veterinarian whose gentle healing touch begins to mend wounds he didn't even know he carried. But their growing love story unfolds against a backdrop of deadly corruption. The town's water is being systematically poisoned by the ruthless land baron Magnus Ashworth, who will stop at nothing to seize control of the entire valley before the railroad arrives. As families fall sick and children die, Rowan must choose between his old life of revenge and a new path of protection and love. Along the way, he discovers shocking secrets about his own identity, including a mother he never knew existed, Celestine Valdez, who has spent 29 years searching for the son she was forced to give up. Together, this unlikely family must expose a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of government, all while dodging hired guns and facing impossible choices. Will Rowan's deadly skills be enough to save the people he's learned to love? Can Sage's unwavering faith in goodness heal a man who has known only violence? And will their love survive when everything they hold dear is threatened by a man who values profit over human life? This is more than just a Western tale. It's a story about finding family in unexpected places, about the healing power of love, and about how even the most hardened heart can learn to hope again. From moonlit rides through dangerous territory to tender moments of vulnerability, from explosive gunfights to quiet promises of forever, this story has everything that makes the Wild West legendary. If you love emotional stories where love transforms lives, where justice triumphs over corruption, and where family means everything, then this tale of the gunslinger who traded his guns for a wedding ring will captivate you from beginning to end. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's journey together to a time when honor meant everything and love could change destiny itself. Before we begin, please like this video if you enjoy emotional Western stories. Subscribe and ring that notification bell for more incredible tales from the frontier, and comment below to let me know what country you're watching from. I love connecting with our global family of story lovers. Now let's travel back to 1887 Montana, where a man named Rowan Blackstone is about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is open your heart. Our story begins with the morning mist clinging to Moonridge Valley like a shroud of forgotten dreams. I never expected to find you here. Gunslinger returns home and discovers unexpected love. The morning mist clung to Moonridge Valley like a shroud of forgotten dreams, and Rowan Blackstone rode through it with the weight of 20 years pressing against his chest. His black stallion's hooves struck the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, steady, determined, and carrying him toward answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The town that had once been his home spread before him like a watercolor painting left too long in the rain. Buildings that had gleamed with prosperity during the silver boom now sagged with the exhaustion of dreams deferred. But it was still beautiful in its melancholy way, nestled between rolling hills that caught the early light like cupped hands holding liquid gold. Rowan pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of what had once been Main Street. 20 years. 20 years since he'd fled this place as a frightened 9-year-old boy, clutching the hand of a stranger who promised him safety. 20 years since his father, Jasper Blackstone, had vanished into legend, leaving behind only whispers of betrayal and a son who would grow up believing his father was a coward. Now at 29, Rowan had earned a reputation as one of the fastest guns in the territories. Men stepped aside when he walked through towns, and women watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination. He had built his life around the certainty that emotion was weakness, that caring for anything beyond your next meal and your horse was a luxury that got you killed. But here in the shadow of his childhood, those carefully constructed walls felt as fragile as morning frost. A commotion from the far end of the street caught his attention. A woman's voice, urgent but not panicked, calling out instructions. Rowan urged his horse forward, drawn by something in that voice, a quality of compassion that seemed foreign in his world of hard men and harder choices. He found her in what appeared to be a makeshift veterinary clinic, a small building with wide doors thrown open to reveal a woman kneeling beside a wounded horse. The animal was clearly in distress, a deep gash along its flank, bleeding steadily onto the straw-covered floor. The woman, she couldn't be more than 26, had auburn hair, pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple brown dress with the sleeves rolled up, her hands steady as she worked to clean the wound. There was something about her movements graceful and sure that made Rowan forget to breathe. "Easy, girl," she murmured to the horse, her voice like warm honey over rough places. "I know it hurts, but we're going to fix you up." Rowan dismounted and approached slowly, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. The woman looked up at the sound, and he felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Her eyes were the deep green of pine forests after rain, and they held an intelligence and warmth that seemed to see straight through the armor he had spent years constructing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, like the moment before lightning strikes. "She needs another pair of hands," the woman said finally, her voice steady despite the flush that had crept up her neck. "If you're not afraid of a little blood." Rowan found himself moving without conscious thought, kneeling beside her and placing his hands where she indicated. The horse was trembling but seemed to calm at his touch. When his fingers brushed against the woman's as they worked together to stanch the bleeding, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a jolt of connection that had nothing to do with fear or violence. "Press here," she instructed, guiding his hands to the correct position. Her touch was gentle but confident, and Rowan found himself studying her profile as she worked. She had a small scar along her jawline, barely visible, and freckles across her nose that spoke of time spent in the sun. "What happened to her?" he asked, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "Caught her leg on barbed wire trying to get away from the Johnson place," she replied, threading a needle with practiced efficiency. "Their water's been making the animals sick. This poor girl was just trying to find something clean to drink." As she began to stitch the wound, Rowan found himself mesmerized by the careful precision of her movements. Her hands were small but strong, marked with the calluses of someone who worked with them daily. When she bent closer to see better, a strand of hair fell across her cheek, and he had to resist the urge to brush it back. "I'm Sage," she said as she worked, not looking up from her stitching. "Sage Ember. I help my father with the medical practice here, though I spend most of my time with the animals. They're usually more honest than people." "Rowan," he replied, then hesitated. "Rowan Blackstone." Her hands stilled for just a moment, and when she looked up, there was something different in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity, but not fear, which surprised him. "Blackstone," she repeated softly. "I thought you might be. You have his eyes." The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. In all his years of traveling, no one had ever said he looked like his father. Most people who remembered Jasper Blackstone remembered only the stories, the coward who ran the trader, who sold out his neighbors. "You knew him?" Rowan's voice was carefully controlled, but Sage seemed to hear the pain beneath it. "I was young when it happened," she said gently, returning to her stitching. "But I remember him being kind. He once helped me catch a bird with a broken wing, taught me how to splint its leg so it could heal properly." The image was so different from the stories Rowan had heard that it made his chest ache. He watched Sage's hands as she finished the last stitch, trying to reconcile this gentle memory with the father he'd been told to forget. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "She should heal well, though she'll need to stay quiet for a few days." She looked up at Rowan, and again he felt that strange electricity in the air between them. "Thank you for your help. I'm not sure I could have managed alone." "It was nothing," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. Something had passed between them in those few minutes of working together, something neither of them could quite name. As they stood, Sage suddenly swayed slightly, and Rowan's hand shot out to steady her. The moment his palm touched her arm, she looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and he felt his carefully maintained control slip another notch. "Sorry," she said, though she didn't step away. "Long night. Mrs. Patterson's cow was having trouble with her calf. You should rest," Rowan said, though he made no move to remove his hand from her arm. Her skin was warm through the thin fabric of her dress, and he could feel her pulse quick and light as a bird's wing. Probably, she agreed, but there was something in her voice that suggested she had no intention of resting anytime soon. "Where are you staying?" And Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house on Elm Street. Clean beds, decent food. "I'll find something," Rowan said finally, forcing himself to step back. The loss of contact felt like a small death. Sage nodded, then hesitated. "Rowan, if you're looking for answers about your father, be careful. Some stones are better left unturned." Before he could ask what she meant, she had turned back to the horse, effectively dismissing him. But as Rowan walked toward the door, he caught her watching him in the reflection of a medical instrument, and he stored the image away like a treasure. The boarding house was easy enough to find, a faded Victorian structure that had seen better decades. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 60s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, showed him to a second-floor room that overlooked the main street. "Breakfast is at 7, she said, smoothing the quilt on the narrow bed. "Supper's at 6 if you're planning to stay that long." "I might be here a few days," Rowan said, setting his saddlebags on the chair by the window. Mrs. Henderson nodded, studying his face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had housed many travelers. "You're Jasper's boy." It wasn't a question, and Rowan didn't try to deny it. "Did you know him?" "Knew your mother better," she said, her voice gentle. Beautiful woman Lydia was. Hair like sunlight and the sweetest singing voice. "She died of the fever when you were barely walking." This was news to Rowan. In all his years of wondering about his parents, no one had ever mentioned his mother. The revelation that she had been real, had been beautiful, had loved him enough to give him life, struck him with unexpected force. "I don't remember her," he said quietly. "You were very young," Mrs. Henderson said kindly, "but you have her smile when you choose to use it." After she left, Rowan stood at the window looking down at the street where children played and women went about their daily business. It was strange to think that he had once belonged here, that these dusty streets had once been the entire world to a small boy with his mother's smile and his father's eyes. A movement across the street caught his attention. Sage emerged from the clinic carrying a black medical bag. She walked with purpose, her skirts swishing around her ankles, and Rowan found himself watching until she disappeared around a corner. He was still standing there when a soft knock came at his door. "Mr. Blackstone?" Mrs. Henderson's voice came through the thin wood. "There's a lady downstairs to see you." Rowan's hand moved instinctively to his gun before he caught himself. Old habits. He made his way downstairs to find a woman waiting in the small parlor, her back to him, as she studied a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. When she turned, Rowan's breath caught in his throat. She was perhaps 45, with silver-threaded black hair and dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. There was something familiar about her face, though he was certain they had never met. "Rowan," she said, and her voice carried the faint trace of an accent he couldn't place. "You grew up to be exactly what I expected." "Do I know you?" he asked, his hand resting casually near his weapon. The woman smiled, and suddenly Rowan could see what had seemed familiar. She had his father's smile, or perhaps he had hers. "My name is Celestine Valdez," she said. "I loved your father very much, and I have something that belongs to you." The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. Another piece of his father's life, another secret that had been kept from him. He studied Celestine's face, looking for deception, and finding only a sadness so deep it seemed to have settled into her bones. "What do you mean?" he asked. Instead of answering directly, Celestine reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Jasper gave this to me the night before he died. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find his son and give it to him." Rowan took the paper with hands that trembled slightly. His name was written on the outside in a careful script he didn't recognize, but somehow knew belonged to his father. Inside, the message was brief but devastating: "My son, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I have failed to protect what matters most. Know that every choice I made was to keep you safe. The truth lies buried where silver dreams die, and trust only those who tend the wounded. Your mother's love lives on in you, and mine will follow you always. JB." "What does it mean?" Rowan asked, his voice hoarse. "Some of it I know," Celestine said gently. "The rest, perhaps we can figure out together." "Why should I trust you?" Celestine was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because, mihijo, I am your mother. The world seemed to stop. Rowan felt his knees buckle slightly, and he had to grab the back of a chair to stay upright. That's impossible. My mother died when I was a baby. Lydia Blackstone died, yes. She was Jasper's wife, and she loved you as if you were her own. Celestine's voice was steady, but tears had begun to track down her cheeks. But I am the woman who gave birth to you, who held you for 3 precious days before circumstances forced me to give you up. Rowan stared at her, his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his family, was crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Because I was 17 and unmarried, and your father was already engaged to another woman. Because my family would have disowned me, and his reputation would have been ruined. Celestine's voice broke slightly. Because I was young and scared, and I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. And now I am older, and I know that there is no pain quite like giving away your own child. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief edged in lace. I have regretted it every day for 29 years. Rowan sank into the chair, his father's letter still clutched in his hands. Does anyone else know? Jasper knew, of course, and Lydia. She was kinder than I deserved. She promised to love you as her own, and she did. Celestine sat down across from him. Doctor, Ember was there when you were born. He's kept the secret all these years. Ember, Sage's father, another connection in this web of secrets that seemed to bind his past to his present. Why tell me now? Rowan asked. Because you have a right to know, and because... Celestine hesitated. Because I think you're going to need family for what's coming. What's coming? But before Celestine could answer, the sound of horses arriving hard and fast echoed from the street outside. Rowan was at the window in an instant, his hand on his gun. 3 riders had pulled up in front of the clinic across the street, and even from a distance, he could see they weren't there for medical attention. Sage, he breathed, and was moving toward the door before he realized he'd spoken aloud. Rowan, wait, Celestine called, but he was already gone, taking the stairs 3 at a time and bursting through the front door. The men at the clinic were dismounting, their hands resting on their weapons. They had the look of hired guns hard men, with cold eyes and no scruples about who they hurt to get what they wanted. Rowan was halfway across the street when Sage appeared in the clinic doorway, her medical bag in one hand and a rifle in the other. She held the weapon with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it, but she was outnumbered 3 to 1. Afternoon, Miss Ember, the leader of the group called his voice, carrying a false friendliness that made Rowan's skin crawl. Mr. Ashworth would like a word with you. Tell Mr. Ashworth I'm busy, Sage replied, her voice steady. Sick animals don't keep bankers' hours. The man's smile turned ugly. I'm afraid he insists. That was when Rowan stepped into the space between them, his coat pushed back to reveal the worn grip of his Colt. The 3 men turned toward him, and he saw the moment they recognized what they were facing. The lady said she was busy, Rowan said quietly. The leader's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped. Whatever reputation Rowan had built over the years, it had apparently reached even this remote corner of Montana. This isn't your fight, stranger, the man said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. Maybe not, Rowan agreed, but I'm making it mine. For a moment, the tension stretched taut as a wire. Then the leader nodded to his companions, and they began backing toward their horses. Tell Miss Ember this isn't over, he called as they mounted. No, Rowan said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. Tell Mr. Ashworth it is. After they rode away, Sage lowered her rifle and turned to look at Rowan. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. Thank you, she said simply. Who's Ashworth? Rowan asked. Magnus Ashworth. He owns most of the land around here, now bought it cheap when folks started getting sick and had to sell. Sage's voice was bitter. He's been pressuring my father to sell the clinic. And you think he's responsible for the water problems? Sage glanced around as if checking to see who might be listening. Come inside, there are things you need to know. The clinic was small but well organized, with medical supplies arranged on shelves and an examination table in the center. Sage set down her rifle and moved to put the kettle on for tea, her movements automatic, despite the tension that still radiated from her. My father has been documenting the illness patterns for months. She set her back to him as she prepared the tea. Animals getting sick in specific areas, always the same symptoms. It's not natural. Poison. We think so. Something in the water upstream. She turned to face him, her green eyes serious. But every time we try to investigate, something happens. Equipment disappears, witnesses change their stories, or men with guns show up to discourage questions, Rowan finished. Exactly. Sage poured hot water over tea leaves, the simple domestic action at odds with their conversation. Your father was investigating the same thing when he died. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. What? Sage set down the teapot and she looked at him directly. Jasper Blackstone wasn't a coward or a traitor. He was trying to expose the men who were poisoning the water and stealing land from sick families. How do you know this? Sage was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I saw him die. The simple statement hung in the air between them like smoke. Rowan felt his world shift again, the carefully constructed narrative of his father's cowardice crumbling even further. You saw what happened. I was 8 years old. Sage said, her hands wrapped around her teacup as if seeking warmth. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. I saw your father meeting with someone by the old mine entrance. Who? Magnus Ashworth. The name fell from her lips like a curse. They argued and then Ashworth shot him in the back while your father was walking away. Rowan felt rage building in his chest, hot and violent and familiar. This was the emotion he understood, the one that had kept him alive for 20 years. But underneath it was something else, a grief so profound it threatened to unmake him entirely. Why didn't you tell anyone? I tried, but I was a child and Ashworth was already powerful. The sheriff, he was in Ashworth's pocket even then. Sage's voice was hollow. They said your father had been killed by outlaws, that his body was lost in the mine collapse that happened the next day. The mine collapse wasn't an accident. No, it was meant to hide the evidence. Rowan set down his teacup with hands that shook slightly. 20 years of believing his father was a coward, 20 years of shame and anger and loneliness, all based on a lie. The magnitude of it was staggering. I'm sorry, Sage said softly. I know this is hard to hear. He was trying to help people. Rowan said, more to himself than to her. He died trying to do the right thing. Yes, the simple affirmation broke something loose in Rowan's chest. He put his face in his hands, and for the first time since he was 9 years old, he wept. Sage didn't say anything, didn't try to comfort him with empty words. Instead, she simply moved her chair closer and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch was warm and steady, anchoring him as 20 years of pain and confusion poured out of him. When the storm finally passed, Rowan found himself looking into Sage's eyes, seeing his own reflection there. She was close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green irises, close enough that he could feel her breath on his cheek. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. For what? For telling me the truth, he struggled for words. For seeing me. Something shifted in Sage's expression, a softening that made his heart race. For a moment, he thought she might kiss him. Instead, she reached up and gently brushed away a tear he hadn't realized was still on his cheek. Your father would be proud of the man you've become, she said softly. The words spoken with such quiet conviction nearly undid him again. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both look toward the door. Dr. Cornelius Ember appeared in the doorway, a distinguished man in his late 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He took in the scene, his daughter sitting close to the notorious gunfighter, both of them with tear-stained faces, and his expression softened with understanding. Sage told you about your father, he said to Rowan. Him of it. Rowan stood, his hand automatically moving toward his gun before he stopped himself. Old habits. Dr. Ember noticed the gesture and smiled sadly. I'm not your enemy's son. I delivered you into this world, and I've been waiting 29 years for you to come home. Celestine said you knew. About your parentage, yes. I've kept many secrets over the years. Dr. Ember moved to his desk and opened a locked drawer, including this one. He withdrew a leather portfolio worn with age. Your father gave this to me the night before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe until his son was old enough to understand. Rowan took the portfolio with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were documents, financial records, correspondence receipts, all painting a picture of systematic theft and corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. This is what got him killed, Dr. Ember said quietly. Proof that Ashworth and his associates were embezzling funds meant for infrastructure and medical supplies, using the money to buy up land from families they'd made sick with contaminated water. Why didn't you do something with this? Who would I have told? The sheriff, the territorial judge? They were all involved. Dr. Ember's voice was bitter. I was one man against a conspiracy that reached from here to the Capitol. Rowan studied the documents, his mind working to piece together the scope of the crime. It was larger than he'd imagined, more complex and far-reaching, but it was also 20 years old. Why now, he asked. Why not let it stay buried? Because they're still doing it, Sage said quietly. The water poisoning, the land grabbing, it never stopped. If anything, it's gotten worse. And because, Dr. Ember added, someone has to speak for the dead. Rowan closed the portfolio and looked at the two people who had, in the space of a few hours, fundamentally changed his understanding of himself and his place in the world. Sage with her gentle hands and fierce spirit, Dr. Ember with his quiet courage and long-held secrets. And somewhere in this town was Celestine, the mother he'd never known. He had waiting for him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. What do you need me to do? He asked. Sage smiled, then the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it was like sunrise after a long dark night. Help us finish what your father started, she said. As if summoned by their conversation, Celestine appeared in the doorway, her dark eyes moving between Rowan and Sage with an expression he couldn't quite read. I see you've met properly, she said to Sage. I had hoped you might. You know each other? Rowan asked. Celestine makes the most beautiful dresses in 3 counties, Sage said. She's been watching over people here for years. Watching over you, Celestine corrected gently. Jasper asked me to look after his son, but you were taken away before I could do much, so I looked after the people he cared about instead. Another revelation in a day full of them. Rowan felt as if he were assembling a puzzle, each piece revealing more of a picture he'd never known existed. There's something else, Celestine said, her voice careful, about why those men came for Sage today. What do you mean Ashworth knows you're here? More than that, he knows who you are. Celestine's expression was grave. He's going to try to use Sage and her father to control you. Let him try, Rowan said, his voice carrying the cold edge that had made him a legend. Rowan, no. Sage placed a hand on his arm. Violence won't solve this. If anything, it will just prove to everyone that you're as dangerous as they think. What would you have me do? Stand by while he threatens innocent people? I'd have you be smart, she said firmly. Be the man your father was, not the man his enemies said he was. The challenge in her voice, the absolute faith in his ability to be better than his reputation, struck him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had believed in him without fear or calculation? What are you suggesting we investigate? Dr. Ember said. Gather evidence. Build a case that can't be ignored or buried. And if Ashworth doesn't wait for us to build a case, then we'll deal with that when it happens, Sage said. But we do it together. Together. The word carried weight that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the way Sage was looking at him, as if she could see past the gunfighter to the man he might become. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Through the window, Rowan could see the town settling into evening routines. Women calling children in for supper. Men walking home from whatever work they could find. The simple rhythms of a community that was struggling, but still alive. All right, he said finally. We do this your way, but if anyone gets hurt because I held back, they won't, Sage said with quiet confidence. Trust me. Trust, another foreign concept in Rowan's world. But looking into Sage's eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, he found himself willing to try. As they made plans for the investigation, as Celestine shared stories of his father that painted a picture of a man driven by conscience rather than cowardice, as Dr. Ember outlined the scope of the corruption they were facing, Rowan felt something shifting inside him. For 20 years, he had been a man without a past, without connections, without hope for anything beyond survival. But here in this small clinic that smelled of antiseptic and lavender, surrounded by people who saw him as more than just a weapon, he began to glimpse the possibility of a different kind of life, When Sage walked him to the door as the evening shadows lengthened, she paused with her hand on the latch. Rowan, what your father wrote in his letter about trusting those who tend the wounded. Yes, he meant people like us, people who try to heal instead of hurt. She looked up at him, her eyes serious. I think he would have wanted you to know that you have that choice too. Before he could respond, she had opened the door and stepped back, leaving him standing on the threshold between his old life and whatever came next. Walking back to the boarding house through the gathering dusk, Rowan carried with him the memory of Sage's touch on his shoulder, the sound of Celestine's voice calling him mihijo, the weight of his father's true legacy in the portfolio under his arm. For the first time in 20 years, Rowan Blackstone was going home. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Rowan woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of the familiar restlessness that usually drove him from town to town, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the next job or the next fight. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, where he found Mrs. Henderson already bustling about the kitchen, the smell of fresh biscuits and coffee filling the air. You're up early, she observed, pouring him a cup of coffee without being asked. Planning to stay in town long? Maybe, Rowan said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. Through the window, he could see lights beginning to flicker on in windows across the street. Mrs. Henderson, what do you know about Magnus Ashworth? Her hands stilled in their work, and when she looked at him, her eyes were troubled. More than I'd like, less than I need to prove anything. She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. He came here about 15 years ago, right after the big silver strike played out. Started buying up land from folks who were struggling. They're always for fair prices. He's with a smile to us. But somehow the folks who sold to him always seemed to get sick first. Livestock dying, children with fevers that wouldn't break, crops failing for no reason anyone could figure. Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely above a whisper. By the time people realized the pattern, it was too late. He owned half the valley. And the other half, he's working on it. She turned back to her biscuits, but Rowan could see the tension in her shoulders. Folks who don't sell, well, they tend to have accidents, or their water goes bad, or their animals start dying. What about the law? Mrs. Henderson's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Sterling's been in Ashworth's pocket since the day he got elected, and the territorial marshal only comes through once a year if we're lucky. The sound of hoofbeats outside made them both turn toward the window. A single rider was approaching at a leisurely pace, not the hard ride of urgent business, but the casual approach of someone who owned the world. Magnus Ashworth was a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed, despite the early hour, with silver-threaded hair, and the kind of face that belonged in a bank or a courtroom rather than on horseback. But there was something in his eyes, a cold calculation, that made Rowan's hand move instinctively toward his gun. Ashworth dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post with the careful movements of a man who was used to being watched. When he looked up at the boarding house, his gaze found Rowan in the window, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. I should get these biscuits out of the oven, Mrs. Henderson said, but Rowan could hear the fear in her voice. Stay inside, Rowan told her, already moving toward the door. Lock it behind me. He stepped onto the porch as Ashworth approached, noting the way the older man's coat was cut to accommodate a shoulder holster. Wealthy he might be, but he wasn't careless. Mr. Blackstone, Ashworth said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man. I was hoping we might have a word. Talk, Rowan said, his hand resting casually near his weapon. Preferably somewhere more private. I have a proposition that might interest you. I'm listening. Ashworth glanced around the street, noting the curtains that had begun twitching in windows as word of his presence spread. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Blackstone. A man of your talents could do well for himself in a place like this. What kind of talents? The kind that solves problems efficiently and permanently. Ashworth's smile never wavered. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous retainer for your services. What makes you think I'm for hire? Everyone's for hire, Mr. Blackstone. It's simply a matter of finding the right price. Ashworth adjusted his coat, the movement drawing attention to the gun beneath it. I'm prepared to be very generous. And what would I be expected to do for this generosity? Nothing you haven't done before, I'm sure. Remove obstacles, discourage competition, ensure that certain investigations, Don't proceed. The offer was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had never been refused. Rowan studied Ashworth's face, noting the assumption of superiority, the certainty that money could buy anything, including a man's soul. That's an interesting proposition, Rowan said finally. Ashworth's smile widened. I thought you might see reason. And there's just one problem with it. Um, I don't work for men who murder children's fathers in the dark. The effect was immediate. Ashworth's smile vanished, and for just a moment, Rowan glimpsed the cold killer beneath the civilized veneer. I'm not sure what you've been told. I've been told the truth, Rowan interrupted, by someone who was there. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, his calculating gaze never leaving Rowan's face. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. Your father was a fool who didn't know when to leave well enough alone. I had hoped his son might be wiser. Disappointed, profoundly. Ashworth stepped back toward his horse. I trust you'll reconsider my offer. The alternative would be unfortunate. For who? Ashworth mounted his horse and looked down at Rowan with the expression of a man contemplating an insect. There are so many ways a person can get hurt in a place like this. Accidents happen. People get sick. Sometimes they just disappear. Is that a threat? It's a reality, Mr. Blackstone. This is my valley. Everything in it exists because I allow it to exist. Ashworth gathered his reins. I'd hate for anything to happen to that lovely young veterinarian. Such a shame when promising young people meet with unexpected misfortune. The threat to Sage hit Rowan like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Ashworth, yes, if anything happens to her, anything at all, I'll come for you, and when I do, it won't be quick. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Ashworth's eyes. Whatever reputation Rowan had built over the years, it was apparently formidable enough to give even a man like Ashworth pause. We'll see, Ashworth said finally, and rode away. Rowan watched until he was out of sight, then became aware of movement in the street around him. People were emerging from their homes, from shops, from hiding places. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and he could see a mixture of fear and hope in their faces. Among them was Sage, hurrying across the street with her medical bag in one hand and worry written across her features. Are you all right? She asked, reaching him slightly out of breath. Fine, but we need to talk. She nodded, studying his face with those remarkable green eyes. Come on, Father is already at the clinic. They walked in silence through the morning streets, but Rowan was acutely aware of Sage beside him, the way she moved with unconscious grace, the way her hair caught the early sunlight, the way she seemed to carry herself as if the weight of other people's pain was something she willingly bore. Dodge Ember was waiting for them at the clinic along with Celestine, who had apparently arrived early. The four of them gathered around the examination table, the portfolio of evidence spread between them like a map of corruption. Ashworth tried to hire me, Rowan said without preamble. To do what? Sage asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. Remove obstacles. Discourage investigations. Rowan's voice was flat. When I refused, he made it clear that people I care about might have accidents. The last phrase slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw Sage's eyes widen slightly at the implication. Celestine, meanwhile, was studying him with the shrewd assessment of a woman who had learned to read between the lines. So he's escalating, Dr. Ember said grimly. That means we're getting close to something important. Or that he's planning something big and wants to clear the field first, Celestine added. Magnus has never been a man to leave loose ends. What kind of something big? Rowan asked. There's a territorial meeting next week, Sage said. Officials coming through to assess the valley for potential railroad expansion. If they decide to route the line through here, and the land values would explode overnight, Dr. Ember finished. Anyone who owns significant acreage would become wealthy beyond imagination. And anyone who didn't would be left with nothing, Rowan said, understanding dawning. He's not just stealing land for the sake of it. He's positioning himself for the railroad money. Exactly, but if the territorial officials discover that he's been systematically poisoning the water supply and forcing people to sell, Celestine trailed off. They'd award the railroad contract to someone else, Sage said. All his years of planning would be for nothing. Rowan studied the documents spread before them, his mind working to piece together the scope of Ashworth's operation. We need to get to the source of the contamination. Document it, photograph it, if possible. The old Silver Peak mine, Dr. Ember said. It's about 10 miles upstream from town. If he's dumping anything into the water supply, that's where it would be. It's also where your father died, Celestine said quietly to Rowan. The statement hung in the air for a moment. Rowan felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, but underneath it was something new, a determination that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Then that's where we go, he said. We, Sage asked. You don't think I'm letting you go alone, do you? Her voice carried a challenge that surprised him. It's dangerous. So is treating animals that have been poisoned by contaminated water, she interrupted. So is living in a town where children get sick because one man values money more than human life. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. I've been fighting this battle a lot longer than you have, Rowan Blackstone. Don't think you can protect me by leaving me behind. The fire in her voice, the absolute determination, struck him like a physical blow. This wasn't the gentle woman who had helped him bandage a horse's wounds. This was someone who had spent years watching her community suffer and was finally seeing a chance to fight back. All right, he said finally, but we do this smart. No unnecessary risks. Agreed. Sage's smile was fierce and beautiful. When do we leave? Tonight, Dr. Ember said. Less chance of being seen. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Rowan cleaned his weapons and checked his ammunition, old habits that felt strange in the context of what was essentially a humanitarian mission. Sage gathered camera equipment borrowed from the Territorial Survey Office, along with sample bottles for collecting contaminated water. As the afternoon wore on, Rowan found himself watching Sage work, noting the way she moved with quiet efficiency, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she seemed to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked. You're staring, she said without looking up from the camera she was loading with film. Sorry, but he didn't look away. It's all right. She glanced up at him, and there was something in her expression that made his heart race. I've been watching you too. The admission hung between them, loaded with possibility. Rowan felt his carefully maintained control slipping, felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. Sage, he started, but she held up a hand to stop him. I know what you're going to say, that you're not the settling kind, that you'll just move on when this is over, that I shouldn't get attached. She set down the camera and looked at him directly. But what if I'm willing to take that risk? The question hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had been willing to risk anything for him? When had anyone looked at him and seen something worth keeping? Before he could answer, Celestine appeared in the doorway of the clinic, her expression urgent. We have a problem, she said. Mrs. Patterson's boy just rode in from the Johnson place. They found 3 of their cattle dead this morning, all showing signs of poisoning. The water source is getting worse, Dr. Ember said grimly. Or Ashworth is escalating the contamination to force more sales before the territorial officials arrive, Sage added. Rowan felt the familiar cold calculation settling over him. How long before the Johnson family starts getting sick? Days, maybe a week if they're lucky, Sage said. We have to move tonight. As evening approached, they made their final preparations. Rowan strapped on his gun belt and checked his rifle, the familiar weight of weapons, a comfort in an uncertain situation. Sage packed medical supplies alongside the camera equipment, and Celestine prepared a saddlebag with food and water for the journey. Dr. Ember would remain in town both to maintain the appearance of normalcy and to treat any new cases of poisoning that might arise. It was a role that clearly frustrated him, but one that was necessary. Be careful, he said to Sage as they prepared to leave. If anything happens to you, nothing will happen, she said, embracing her father. We'll be back before dawn. But as they rode out of town under cover of darkness, Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding into something far more dangerous than a simple investigation. The trail to Silver Peak Mine wound through rugged country following an old pack road that had been carved into the hillside during the height of the silver boom. In the moonlight, the landscape looked alien and forbidding, all sharp shadows and uncertain footing. Sage rode beside him on a sturdy mare. Her posture relaxed despite the circumstances. She was an accomplished rider, he noted, moving with her horse rather than fighting it, adapting to the uncertain terrain with the skill of someone who had grown up in the saddle. Tell me about your father, she said as they climbed toward the mine. What was he like before everything went wrong? Rowan was quiet for a moment, surprised by how difficult the question was to answer. For so many years, he had tried not to think about Jasper Blackstone at all. I don't remember much, he said finally. I was only 9 when he died, but I remember him reading to me at night, teaching me to ride, showing me how to whittle. He paused. I remember feeling safe when he was around. He sounds like a good father. He was. At least I think he was. Rowan's voice was rough with emotion he wasn't used to expressing. It's hard to know what's real memory and what's just wishful thinking. The safety you felt, that was real, Sage said with quiet certainty. Children know when they're loved, even if they can't always remember the details. The simple statement hit him with unexpected force. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of believing his father was a coward, a traitor who had abandoned his family for money. But sitting here in the moonlight, beside this remarkable woman, he began to understand that love and safety could coexist with danger, that a man could be both gentle and strong. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the pine needles that carpeted the trail. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of evergreens and the distant promise of snow. It was Sage who spotted the glow first, a faint orange light visible through the trees ahead. That shouldn't be there, she said, reining in her horse. Rowan pulled up beside her, his hand moving automatically to his rifle. Campfire. Maybe, or just, she trailed off, but he could see the worry in her expression. They dismounted and tied their horses to a stand of aspen trees, then approached on foot. The light grew stronger as they climbed, and soon Rowan could hear voices, rough men talking in low tones about things that made his blood run cold. Another barrel goes in tomorrow night. Boss says to make sure the Johnson place gets a good dose. Territorial boys won't know what hit 'em. Rowan and Sage exchanged a look, and he saw his own understanding reflected in her eyes. This wasn't just about land grabbing anymore. Ashworth was planning something for the territorial officials, something that involved the same poison that had been killing livestock and sickening children. They crept closer, using the cover of rocks and scrub brush to get within sight of the operation. What they saw made Rowan's stomach turn. The old mine entrance had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Barrels of chemicals sat stacked against the hillside, and a crude distillation apparatus bubbled over an open fire. 3 men worked around the equipment, their faces covered with cloth masks that did little to protect them from the toxic fumes. But it was the stream that made Sage gasp in horror. A pipe led from the chemical operation directly into the creek that fed Moonridge Valley's water supply. Whatever poison Ashworth's men were brewing was being pumped directly into the water that families depended on for survival. Sage began setting up the camera, her movements quick and efficient despite the danger. Rowan kept watch, counting men and weapons, planning escape routes and contingencies. But part of his mind was reeling from the sheer scope of Ashworth's cruelty. This wasn't just about money or land. This was genocide, the systematic poisoning of an entire community for the sake of one man's greed. The soft click of the camera's shutter seemed deafeningly loud in the night air. Sage worked quickly, capturing images of the operation from multiple angles, documenting the pipe that fed poison into the stream, the barrels of chemicals, the men who worked without regard for the lives they were destroying. But as she moved to get a better angle, her foot dislodged a loose stone that clattered down the hillside. The effect was immediate. The 3 men stopped their work and looked up, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. Rowan saw one of them reach for a rifle. "Time to go," he whispered to Sage. But it was too late. A shout echoed through the night air, followed by the distinctive crack of a rifle shot. The bullet struck a rock inches from Rowan's head, sending stone chips flying. "Run!" he told Sage, pushing her toward the trees where they had left their horses. More shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly stars. Rowan returned fire, not trying to hit anyone, but rather to keep the shooters pinned down while Sage escaped. They reached around their horses as lanterns began to bob through the trees, more men apparently summoned by the gunfire. Rowan boosted Sage into her saddle, then swung onto his own horse as bullets began to buzz through the air around them. The ride back to town was a nightmare of moonlight and shadows of uncertain footing, and the constant fear that pursuit might catch them at any moment. But Sage proved herself an able partner, keeping pace with him even when the trail seemed to disappear entirely in the darkness. It wasn't until they were within sight of Moonridge Valley's lights that Rowan allowed himself to believe they had escaped. But as they slowed their horses to a walk approaching the edge of town, Sage suddenly pulled up short. "Rowan," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Look." He followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Smoke was rising from the center of town, and even from a distance, he could see the orange glow of fire. "The clinic," Sage whispered, and then she was spurring her horse forward, all caution forgotten. Rowan followed, his heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety and everything to do with the people he had come to care about. As they rode into town, he could see that it wasn't just the clinic burning. Several buildings were ablaze and people were running through the streets with buckets of water, trying desperately to save what they could. But it was too late for the clinic. By the time they arrived, the building was fully engulfed, the flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Dr. Ember stood in the street, watching his life's work burn, his face streaked with soot and tears. "Father," Sage leaped from her horse and ran to him, and Rowan felt something ease in his chest when he saw that the older man was unharmed. "The files, Doctor," Ember said as Sage embraced him. 20 years of medical records, all the documentation of the poisoning patterns. It's all gone." "We got photographs," Sage told him. "Evidence of the operation upstream. We can prove what Ashworth's been doing." But even as she spoke, Rowan was scanning the crowd, looking for other familiar faces. He spotted Mrs. Henderson near the boarding house, which thankfully seemed untouched by the fires. But it was the absence of one particular face that made his stomach clench with dread. "Where's Celestine?" he asked. Ember's expression grew even more grim. "They took her, Rowan, right after the fires started. 3 men led by someone I didn't recognize." "Ashworth." "Shirth." Rowan said, his voice flat with deadly certainty. "There was a message," Dr. Ember continued. "They said to tell you that if you want to see her again, you'll bring the photographs to the old church on the hill, alone, tomorrow at sunset." Rowan felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, but underneath it was something new, a fierce protectiveness that extended beyond his own survival to encompass the people he had come to love. Celestine, who had carried the secret of his parentage for 29 years. Dr. Ember, who had delivered him into the world and kept his father's secrets. And Sage. He looked at her as she comforted her father, noting the way the firelight caught in her hair, the determined set of her jaw, despite the tears on her cheeks. In the space of just 2 days, she had become more important to him than his own life. "It's a trap," Sage said, reading his expression. "Of course it's a trap." Rowan's voice was steady, but she could see the storm building behind his eyes. "But he has my mother." The words slipped out naturally, and Rowan realized that somewhere in the midst of all this chaos, he had begun to think of Celestine that way. Not as the stranger who had given birth to him, but as the woman who had loved his father and spent 29 years waiting for the chance to know her son. "We'll get her back," Sage said fiercely, "but not by walking into Ashworth's trap alone." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we give him exactly what he wants," she said, her green eyes bright with determination. "But not the way he expects." As the fires burned themselves out and the people of Moonridge Valley salvaged what they could from the destruction, 4 unlikely allies gathered in the ruins of the clinic to plan a rescue that would either save everything they cared about or destroy them all. But for the first time since he was 9 years old, Rowan Blackstone wasn't fighting alone. The old church on the hill had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its white paint peeling like ancient skin and its bell tower standing silent against the Montana sky. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson, Rowan Blackstone rode toward what might be his final confrontation. But he wasn't riding alone. The plan they had devised in the pre-dawn hours was audacious in its simplicity. Sage would approach from the east, using the cover of the old cemetery to get into position with the camera equipment. Dr. Ember would remain in town, ready to signal the territorial marshal's deputy, who was due to arrive on the evening train. And Rowan would walk into Ashworth's trap exactly as requested, but with a few modifications the land baron wouldn't expect. Hidden beneath his black coat, Rowan carried not just his usual weapons, but also a small mirror that would allow him to signal Sage when the moment was right. In his saddlebags, carefully wrapped to look like photographic plates, were blank pieces of glass that would buy them precious time when Ashworth discovered the deception. As he approached the church, Rowan could see that Ashworth had chosen his location well. The building sat on a rise that commanded views in all directions, making it impossible to approach unseen. But it also meant that anyone inside would be exposed if the situation turned violent. The church doors stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Rowan dismounted and tied his horse to a weathered hitching post, then walked toward the building with the measured pace of a man who had faced death many times before. But this time was different. This time he had something to lose. Inside the church was a study in faded grandeur. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and stained glass windows threw fractured rainbows of light across the dusty boards. At the altar where couples had once promised to love each other, for better or worse, Magnus Ashworth waited with a smile that never reached his eyes. Beside him, bound to a chair, but visibly unharmed, sat Celestine. Her dark eyes met Rowan's across the nave, and he saw relief and pride warring in her expression. Even in captivity, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had faced hardship and survived. "Mr. Blackstone," Ashworth said, his cultured voice echoing in the empty space, "how good of you to join us. I trust you brought what I requested." Rowan held up a leather portfolio. "Photographs and negatives, everything we collected last night." "Excellent." Ashworth gestured to two men who emerged from the shadows, hard-faced gunmen who kept their weapons trained on Celestine. "Now, if you would be so kind as to place them on the altar and step back." Rowan moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning the church for other threats. He counted 4 men total, not including Ashworth himself. Good odds for a man of his reputation, but not when an innocent woman's life hung in the balance. As he placed the portfolio on the altar, Rowan caught the flash of sunlight on glass from the cemetery's sage in position and ready. He adjusted his coat slightly, angling the hidden mirror to catch the light. "You know this won't end here," Rowan said, straightening up. "People know what you've been doing. Burning down the clinic, taking hostages, you've gone too far this time." Ashworth's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Have I? Who's going to stop me? The sheriff who's been in my pocket for 15 years. The territorial officials who'll be drinking poisoned water with their dinner tonight." He moved closer to Celestine, his hand resting on the back of her chair. "By tomorrow morning, this entire valley will be mine, and anyone who might have objected will be too sick to care." The casual admission of mass murder hit Rowan like a physical blow. "You're talking about killing dozens of innocent people." "I'm talking about eliminating obstacles to progress," Ashworth corrected. "Ashworth. This valley has potential, Mr. Blackstone. Railroad money, mining rights, federal land grants, millions of dollars in opportunity. A few sick settlers are a small price to pay for such prosperity. They're not just settlers, they're families, children. They're acceptable losses." Ashworth opened the portfolio and began examining the contents, his expression growing darker as he realized the deception. "Glass plates, blank glass plates." His voice was deadly quiet. "Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for such a simple trick?" Rowan's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when one of Ashworth's men pressed a rifle barrel against Celestine's temple. "I thought you might try something like this," Ashworth continued, "which is why I took out a little insurance policy." He nodded toward the church doors where more men appeared, and with them a sight that made Rowan's blood turn to ice. Dr. Ember, battered and bound, was being forced at gunpoint toward the altar. "It seems your friends were planning their own little deception," Ashworth said. "My men found Dr. Ember trying to signal the train station. Apparently he thought he could summon help." Rowan felt the walls closing in around him. With both Celestine and Dr. Ember as hostages, his options had just become drastically limited. "Now then," Ashworth said, drawing a nickel-plated revolver from his coat, "since you've chosen to play games, perhaps we should discuss the real terms of our arrangement, which are simple. You're going to walk out of here and disappear forever. In exchange, I'll allow these good people to live." Ashworth's smile was that of a predator playing with wounded prey. "Of course they'll be my guests for a while just to ensure you don't change your mind about our agreement. And if I refuse, then I'll kill them both right here, right now. And tomorrow when the territorial officials start dying from the special water I've prepared for them, everyone will blame the notorious gunfighter who came to town looking for trouble." It was a perfect trap, Rowan realized. Ashworth would eliminate his enemies, frame him for mass murder, and walk away clean. The man's thoroughness was as impressive as it was terrifying. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated Sage Ember. The first shot came through the broken stained glass window, taking out one of Ashworth's gunmen, before anyone realized they were under attack. The second shot fired from the cemetery shattered a support beam and brought down part of the roof, creating chaos and confusion in the sanctuary. In the sudden pandemonium, Rowan moved. He rolled behind a fallen pew as bullets began flying, his own gun clearing leather with the fluid motion of long practice. One of Ashworth's men went down immediately, clutching his shoulder and screaming. "Kill them!" Ashworth shouted, diving for cover behind the altar. "Kill them all!" But the advantage of surprise was with Rowan now. He moved through the church like a ghost, using the broken pews and scattered debris for cover, his shots precise and deadly. These men were thugs and bullies used to intimidating unarmed settlers. They had never faced anyone like him. More shots came from outside as Sage continued her assault on the building, her fire carefully aimed to avoid the area where the hostages were held. Rowan could hear Ashworth cursing as his carefully laid plans crumbled around him. "Enough!" Ashworth suddenly appeared from behind the altar, his gun pressed against Celestine's temple. "Drop your weapons, Blackstone, or I'll paint these walls with her brains." Rowan froze, his Colt half raised. Across the church, he could see Celestine's calm, dark eyes, and in them, he read a message that chilled him to the bone. She was telling him to take the shot. "You won't do it," Rowan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You need her alive to control me." "Do I?" Ashworth's finger tightened on the trigger. "Maybe I'll just settle for revenge." But before he could fire, a new voice echoed through the church, one that made everyone freeze in their tracks. "Put down your weapons. This is Deputy Marshal Williams, and this building is surrounded." Through the broken windows, Rowan could see men in federal uniforms taking positions around the church. The cavalry had arrived, but whether they were there to help or to arrest him remained to be seen. Ashworth's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a cold determination that Rowan recognized all too well. It was the look of a man who had decided that if he couldn't win, he would take as many people down with him as possible. "Stand down, Ashworth," came the marshal's voice. "We have evidence of your criminal activities. Surrender now and you'll live to stand trial." "Evidence?" Ashworth laughed, the sound echoing madly through the ruined church. "What evidence? The clinic burned down. The photographs are blanks, and the only witnesses are right here where I can silence them permanently." That was when Sage appeared in the church doorway, her camera in her hands and a smile of fierce triumph on her face. "Not the only witnesses," she said, "and not the only photographs." Ashworth's face went white as understanding dawned. "You took pictures of the mine operation." "Complete documentation," Sage confirmed. "The chemical apparatus, the poison being pumped into the water supply, your men at work. Everything the federal authorities need to shut you down permanently." "Plus," added a new voice as Dr. Ember managed to work his gag loose, "the water samples we collected yesterday before the clinic burned. I sent them to the Territorial Health Office on the morning train, along with a full report of the poisoning patterns." The trap that Ashworth had set so carefully had become a trap for himself. Rowan could see the moment when the land baron realized that his empire of corruption was crumbling around him, that all his years of careful planning had come to nothing. And in that moment of realization, Magnus Ashworth made his final desperate play. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking all of you with me." He swung his gun away from Celestine and towards Sage, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he had forgotten one crucial thing about the man he was facing. Rowan Blackstone hadn't earned his reputation by being slow. The Colt bucked in Rowan's hand, the report deafening in the confined space. Ashworth spun around, his own shot going wide, and crashed into the altar with blood spreading across his expensive shirt. For a moment, the church was absolutely silent, except for the sound of settling debris and labored breathing. Then Celestine was free, cutting her own bonds with a knife she had somehow managed to conceal and rushing to untie Dr. Ember, while federal marshals swarmed into the building. But Rowan only had eyes for Sage. She ran to him across the debris-strewn floor, and when she reached him, he caught her in his arms and held her as if he would never let go. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands running over his chest and arms checking for wounds. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But when I saw him turn that gun on you—" "I know," she whispered, standing on her toes to frame his face with her hands. "I know." And then, surrounded by the chaos of law enforcement and the ruins of their enemies' ambitions, Rowan Blackstone kissed Sage Ember for the first time. It was a kiss that spoke of desperation and relief, of fear conquered and love discovered, of two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan became aware that they had an audience. Deputy Marshal Williams, a stern-faced man in his 40s, was watching them with an expression of professional curiosity. "Mr. Blackstone," the marshal said, "we need to talk." And 3 months later, the wedding was held in the rebuilt church on the hill, the same building where Magnus Ashworth had made his final stand and lost everything. But now, instead of broken windows and scattered debris, there were flowers and ribbons, and the happy voices of a community celebrating new beginnings. Sage wore a dress of ivory silk that Celestine had sewn for her, working late into the night to ensure every detail was perfect. Her hair was crowned with wildflowers gathered from the meadows that were once again safe for children to play in, and her eyes held the radiant happiness of a woman deeply in love. Rowan stood at the altar in a black suit that was perhaps the most formal clothing he had ever worn, his usually wild hair tamed for the occasion, but his blue eyes still holding that dangerous edge that had made him a legend. The gun belt was gone, replaced with a simple black sash that Celestine had embroidered with silver thread. The minister was Dr. Ember himself, granted special authority to perform the ceremony by the territorial governor, as thanks for his role in exposing the corruption that had plagued the valley. His voice was warm as he spoke the ancient words that would bind his daughter to the gunfighter who had become like a son to him. "Do you, Rowan Blackstone, take Sage Ember to be your wife, to love her and honor her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Rowan said, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "with everything I am and everything I hope to become." "And do you, Sage Ember, take Rowan Blackstone to be your husband, to love him and honor him in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Sage replied, her voice steady and sure. "Now and always." The ring Rowan slipped onto her finger was made from silver reclaimed from the old Blackstone clay metal his father had pulled from the earth with his own hands, refined by the town jeweler, into a symbol of enduring love. It caught the light from the stained glass windows as he lifted her hand to his lips. When Dr. Ember pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in celebration. The entire population of Moonridge Valley seemed to be in attendance, their faces bright with joy and hope for the future. But as Rowan and Sage walked down the aisle together, his arm around her waist and her hand on his chest, they only had eyes for each other. The reception was held in the town square with tables laden with food and a small band playing fiddle music that had couples dancing until late into the evening. Children ran between the tables, their laughter, a sound that had been missing from the valley for too long, and old-timers told stories of better days that seemed possible again. Rowan found himself standing apart from the celebration for a moment, watching Sage dance with her father, while Celestine looked on with tears of joy in her dark eyes. The federal investigation had cleared him of any wrongdoing in Ashworth's death self-defense. In protection of civilians, the official report had concluded, and the bounty on his head had been quietly lifted in recognition of his service to the community. He was a free man for the first time in 20 years. Free to love and be loved. Free to build something lasting instead of just surviving until the next fight. "Regrets," said Deputy Marshal Williams, approaching with 2 glasses of punch. "None," Rowan said, accepting the drink. "Though I never thought I'd see the day when a federal marshal would attend my wedding." Williams chuckled. "The world's changing, Blackstone. Men like you, men who can evolve beyond their reputations, you're exactly what this territory needs as it grows up. I'm not sure I know how to be anything other than what I've been." "You'll learn," Williams said confidently. "Besides, you'll have help." He nodded towards Sage, who had finished her dance and was making her way through the crowd toward them. Her face was flushed with happiness and exertion, and when she smiled at Rowan, he felt his heart skip a beat, just as it had that first day in the clinic. "Mrs. Blackstone," Williams said with a formal bow, "congratulations." "Thank you, Marshal," Sage replied, then looked up at her new husband. "Ready to start our new life?" "More than ready," Rowan said, offering her his arm. They walked together through the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their neighbors, but eventually finding themselves on the edge of the square where they could look out over the valley that had become their home. "What are you thinking about?" Sage asked, noting his contemplative mood. About my father, Rowan said. About how he would feel seeing this place healthy again, seeing the people he died trying to protect finally getting justice. He would be proud, Sage said with quiet certainty, not just of what you did, but of who you've become. And who have I become? Sage turned to face him, her green eyes serious. A man who fights for love instead of running on from it. A man who protects instead of destroys. A man who builds instead of tears down. That's who you see when you look at me. That's who you've always been, Rowan Blackstone. You just needed the right reason to let him show. As if to prove her point, a small voice called out from behind them. Mr. Rowan, Mrs. Sage. They turned to see little Emma Patterson running toward them, her face bright with excitement. She was the daughter of the family whose cattle had been among the first victims of Ashworth's poisoning, and she had been one of the sickest children in the valley. Now she was healthy and happy, her cheeks pink with life, and her eyes sparkling with mischief. Look what I found, she said, holding up a small bouquet of wildflowers. For your wedding, Sage knelt down to accept the flowers, her eyes misting with tears. They're beautiful, Emma. Thank you. Are you really going to live here forever? The child asked. Even though you're famous now, Rowan laughed, crouching down beside his wife. Where did you hear that I was famous? My papa says you're the fastest gun in the whole territory, Emma said with obvious awe. But Mama says that doesn't matter because you're one of the good ones now. Your mama's very wise, Sage said, glancing at Rowan with amusement. Will you teach me to shoot? Emma asked eagerly. When you're older, Rowan said diplomatically. Much older, and only if your parents say it's all right. Emma nodded solemnly, then threw her small arms around both of them in an impulsive hug before running back to the celebration. One of the good ones now, Rowan repeated thoughtfully. You always were, Sage said, rising and smoothing her skirts. You just needed someone to believe in you. As the evening wore on and the celebration gradually wound down, Rowan and Sage found themselves walking toward their new home, a small house on the edge of town that Dr. Ember had built for them as a wedding gift. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a wide front porch, but it was theirs. Inside, Celestine had left wedding gifts on the kitchen table, preserves and bread for their first breakfast as a married couple, along with a small wrapped package that made Sage gasp when she opened it. It was a silver locket, beautifully engraved with their initials and the date of their wedding. It was your father's, Celestine explained in the note that accompanied it. He gave it to me when you were born, Rowan. Now it belongs to your wife and someday to your children. The thought of children of a family was still new enough to make Rowan's breath catch. But looking at Sage in the lamplight, seeing the love and hope in her eyes, he could imagine a future filled with laughter and small voices and the kind of happiness he had never dared dream of. What are you thinking about now? Sage asked, noting his distant expression. About tomorrow, he said, pulling her into his arms. About next week, next month, next year. About all the tomorrows we're going to have together. And what do you see in those tomorrows? Rowan was quiet for a moment, considering. I see us growing old together in this valley. I see children playing in our yard and grandchildren climbing on my lap while I tell them stories about their grandfather Jasper. I see myself becoming the man you already believe I am. That sounds perfect, Sage whispered, standing on her toes to kiss him. There's one more thing, Rowan said when they broke apart. What's that? I see myself loving you more every day for the rest of my life. The words spoken with such quiet intensity brought tears to Sage's eyes. Promise me. I promise, he said solemnly, with everything I am and everything I hope to become. Outside, the sounds of the celebration were fading as the last of their neighbors made their way home. The valley that had been poisoned and sick was healing, its water running clean again, its people looking toward the future with hope instead of fear. And in a small house on the edge of Moonridge Valley, 2 people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances began their life together, carrying the blessings of the past and the promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. Rowan Blackstone had spent 20 years running from love, convinced that caring was weakness and that connection was a luxury he couldn't afford. But in the green eyes of a woman who tended wounded animals and the gentle wisdom of a mother he had never known he had discovered something more powerful than any reputation built on violence. He had discovered that some things were worth dying for, but love, real lasting, transformative love, was worth living for. And as he held his wife in his arms in their new home, listening to her heartbeat steady and sure against his chest, Rowan Blackstone finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Love was the only battle worth winning. In the years that followed, Rowan and Sage Blackstone became pillars of the Moonridge Valley community. Rowan served as sheriff for 2 terms, using his reputation to keep the peace rather than sow discord. Sage established a veterinary practice that served not only their valley, but 3 neighboring counties. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, who grew up hearing stories of their grandfather Jasper and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Celestine lived to see each of them born, finally finding the family she had searched for her entire life. The Territorial Railroad did come through Moonridge Valley, eventually bringing prosperity without the corruption that Magnus Ashworth had envisioned. The town grew and thrived, becoming a symbol of what communities could accomplish when good people stood together against evil. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the mountain air was crisp and clean, folks would see an older couple walking hand in hand through the streets of the town they had helped save their love, still shining as bright as it had on that first day when a gunfighter learned that some wounds could only be healed by the gentle touch of a woman who saw past his scars to the man beneath. Love, as Jasper Blackstone had written in his final letter, truly was worth living for.